We're going to talk more about this now with geostrategy expert Imran Bayoumi. Thanks so much for joining us. What were your thoughts on this announcement when you first heard that it was going to be this economic D-Day? Is that what it was?
I think at this point, there's a few outstanding questions that I have. The first is, to what extent is the U.S. going to pressure or enforce these sanctions, whatever they may be, eventually on China? China is Iran's largest buyer of oil. At the same time, we've seen the Trump administration really try to preserve this kind of détente with China when it comes to trade. We know Xi Jinping is scheduled to visit D.C. here in a month or so. China has demonstrated leverage over the U.S. with critical minerals before. So really, that's my main question. What's the U.S. response to China going to look like? And then second, what will Iran's response be? I think we've seen the Iranian regime respond before to Trump's threats. They may try to escalate via military action. I would just end by saying they've experienced living under sanctions for a long time. They're adept at evading them, at adapting around them. Eventually, I think if these are really that broad, they could spell the end of the regime. But that's a timeline question, and we don't know how long that will be.
Well, let's get back to the China angle. The Trump administration betting that the U.S. economy is a powerful enough tool to get rivals like China to give in to its demands. But we are speaking about China, one of the biggest economies in the world. Would that really be the case?
I think that's a big question. I think what we've seen is China steadily build up its own reserves, decrease its reliance on the United States and other Western economies. And China has ignored these kind of threats in the past. I think it's, a big leap of faith to assume that they will now respond to what the U.S. is saying and adhere to its demands.
By continually threatening these sanctions, would you say that the U.S. is perhaps sending a signal that it does not want to go back to fighting in Iran?
I think that may be part of it. I think the other thing, though, is that this is maybe a recognition that military strikes have run their limit. I think we've seen that these kind of repeated attacks of bombing across Iran have failed to really change the calculus. We still have the regime in power. Certainly there's a new leader, but it's the same regime. It hasn't fallen. The Iranian people have not overthrown the government. If anything, they faced more repression. Gulf allies still are under attack. The Strait of Hormuz remains closed. And so I think this is an attempt by the Trump administration to figure out a new tactic to try to pressure Iran on a new front. But ultimately, I think another question we have to ask is, what is the end goal here? What is the strategy we're trying to achieve through these tariffs and sanctions? Is it to end the regime, to open the strait? That's a big question.
No, please talk a bit more about that. What exactly do you think it's trying to do?
Well, I think one of the problems with this conflict is we haven't had the goals clearly communicated from the start. We saw shifting statements at the start of the war. This was to allow the Iranian people to rise up and overthrow the regime. And then shift to bombing to get to negotiations over the nuclear program. Now, the current line seems to be some sort of attempt to force negotiations to open the Strait of Hormuz, which was open before the war started. And so, I think we need to understand what exactly these sanctions are trying to achieve. Are they trying to really spell the downfall of the regime? Or are they more focused on trying to force Iran to the negotiating table to re-engage on that 14-point plan in a way that military strikes weren't effective in pushing Iran to the table?
Iran has been under sanctions for decades now. This time it has vowed to retaliate to these new sanctions. What kind of leverage does Iran have at the moment? And do you think that these sanctions will really make it bend the knee, so to speak?
So I think Iran's primary leverage is, one, the Strait of Hormuz remains closed, but we know that. So I think the way it could escalate is by attacking countries across the Gulf region, U.S. military installations based in those countries, and U.S. partners and allies in the region as well. The challenge, I think, for the United States is that these countries are already starting to move maybe away from Washington and have recognized that they can't rely on Washington's security guarantees long term. That's why you saw Saudi Arabia join with Pakistan and Turkey to form the Mecca Pact, right? It's a hedging against the United States and trying to build their own regional capabilities. And so the U.S. needs its allies and partners for these sanctions to work at a time when it's maybe not being the best partner it could be.
Imran, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us. That's a geostrategy expert, Imran Bayoumi. Thank you.